Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. One of the real and tangible outcomes of the negotiations that took place between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Istanbul was the fact that the Kremlin finally informed the Ukrainian delegation about the full text of the so-called memorandum, which President Putin had previously promised to provide to the Ukrainian side during his last phone conversation with President Trump. And by the way, before we look at the text of the document itself, I want to remind you that President Trump advised President Putin, according to the American leader's own words, to provide such a document that Ukraine and the Europeans would not be ready to reject right from the very first point. And it was precisely this task that Putin failed to accomplish, if only because obviously he never intended to fulfill it. Because after the very first point, you could, so to speak, stop reading the text altogether, since it talks about international legal recognition that Crimea, as well as the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions of Ukraine have become part of the Russian Federation. And the memorandum also calls for the complete withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from these regions. In other words, this is about the old Russian demand to withdraw Ukrainian troops from those territories they cannot conquer, but which, according to their fake legislation, have been annexed by Russia. And as you can see, this point is further reinforced by the fact that Russia is demanding not only the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops, but also that the status of Crimea and other occupied Ukrainian regions be recognized by other countries around the world. That is, once again, as we can see, ending the war in Ukraine depends on how not only Ukraine itself, but also other countries respond to Russian aggression against our country. Well, of course, we already understand that all of this is being said so that no serious issues can actually be discussed within the framework of this memorandum. However, let's look further. Of course, the second point talks about Ukraine's neutrality, rejecting any possibility for our country to participate in any military alliances or even bilateral security agreements with other states. This is also asserted in the third point. Just like Ukraine's non-nuclear status, Ukraine is also prohibited from producing any other weapons intended to protect our state from external aggression. The next point again emphasizes the need to set the size of the armed forces of Ukraine and other paramilitary formations, as well as to disband what Moscow refers to as nationalist formations within the armed forces of Ukraine and the National Guard of Ukraine. A separate point, which is absolutely clear, is the guarantee of the rights, freedoms, and interests of the Russian and Russian-speaking population, as well as granting the Russian language official status. This is a long-standing point that the Russians included back in Viktor Yanukovych's election program in 2004, and since then have been trying by any means to introduce into Ukrainian legislation. It is also demanded to ban the propaganda of Nazism and neo-Nazism. Let me remind you that, in fact, the propaganda of Nazism as well as communism is prohibited by Ukrainian law. But along with this, it is proposed to dissolve nationalist organizations and parties. And it is obvious that what constitutes nationalist organizations and parties will not be decided in Ukraine, but in the Russian Federation. The memorandum also provides for the removal of all new economic sanctions and the lifting of those already in effect, as well as bans between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And also, of course, it is stated that Ukraine must renounce any claims related to the destruction caused by the Russian Federation during its aggression and lift any restrictions against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. As we can see, the Russian language and the Russian church remain the main elements of Russian political interest. And then it talks about the restoration of diplomatic and economic relations. And here it is specifically stated that Russia aims to restore gas transit through Ukrainian territory. This is also absolutely clear Moscow's goal. As we can see, Ukraine's refusal to continue the transit of Russian gas has become a painful issue for Putin's main cash cow, the Russian joint stock company Gazprom. The second section of this so-called memorandum specifically addresses the conditions for a ceasefire. Let me remind you that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, actually demanded an unconditional ceasefire. However, after speaking with Putin, he unexpectedly abandoned the very idea of unconditionality in conversations with European leaders and the President of Ukraine, and even began to claim that he had never said anything of the sort. He did say it. But it is clear that this second section will be closely examined by the Americans. And here there are several options for how the ceasefire should be implemented. However, it is obvious that the Russians link any ceasefire to the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territories of the occupied regions of Ukraine. And also, since it says the territory of Russia, including these regions, it is obviously implied that the Kursk region is included as well. But what is being discussed is the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops, not only from these territories, but also to a distance from the borders of the Russian Federation that will be agreed upon. That is, once again, without any fighting, it is being proposed to create a buffer zone. And Russia, of course, intends to determine the distance at which there will be no Ukrainian troops at our territory, that will be completely calm and open for further Russian military expansion. Because according to this memorandum, it would not even be possible to defend it. And of course, it will be necessary to prohibit any redeployment of the armed forces of Ukraine, any further mobilization process into the armed forces of Ukraine, any foreign military assistance, and any military presence of third countries on the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine must provide guarantees to renounce so-called sabotage and subversive activities against the Russian Federation. In other words, it will no longer be able to defend itself against Russia or destroy its military potential. A bilateral center for monitoring and controlling the ceasefire will be established, as well as an amnesty for those whom Russia refers to as political prisoners, in quotation marks. In other words, it may consider that, in its view, it does not have any political prisoners. And the release of civilians and the lifting of martial law in Ukraine. But there is another important point that should determine the ceasefire: the announcement of the date for holding the elections for the President of Ukraine and the Verkhovna Rada, which must take place no later than 100 days after the lifting of martial law. In other words, the Russian Federation is allowing itself to openly interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs and internal life, and to impose deadlines for holding elections in our own country. As if we were still living in the Soviet Union, where the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would tell the leadership of a Union Republic when to hold the next Congress of the Republican Party organization. And all of this is taken completely seriously. But it is also very important to note that this interference in internal affairs is part of a sequence of steps aimed at implementing measures for a ceasefire and peace. That is, first it is proposed to start working on the text of the agreement, then to declare a truce for 2 or 3 days and hand over to the Ukrainian side the bodies of the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. It is obvious that this is exactly what was agreed upon in Istanbul. Then, a memorandum on the cessation of hostilities may be signed, with specific dates for the implementation of all its articles and the determination of the date for signing the future agreement on the final settlement. And only then, when the armed forces of Ukraine begin to leave Ukrainian territory, a 30-day ceasefire period will be established. And within these 30 days, the armed forces of Ukraine must leave the entire territory of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions and withdraw to a distance within Ukrainian territory that will be determined by the Russian military command. After that, as we have already seen in the previous text of this proposal, elections for the president and the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine must be held. And only after this, with the new president of Ukraine and the new parliament, will the Russians be ready to sign a peace agreement. That is, these proposals also state that President Putin does not recognize the current Ukrainian government as legitimate. But that's not the end of the story. Even after the agreement is signed, the Russians will not consider it to be in effect until it is approved by the UN Security Council. In other words, it will be very important for the Russians that this agreement is recognized, even if it is an agreement on Ukraine's capitulation, and that is exactly what it is by Western countries, so that they will not be able to help our country in the future stages when Russia launches a new campaign to occupy our territory. And only after the Western countries sign off that they will not help Ukraine be voting for this illusory agreement at the UN Security Council meeting will this agreement be ratified by the Russian State Duma, and to be absolutely precise, yes, by the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada. Because we all understand perfectly well, and I want to assure you of this, that the Russian State Duma has no intention of ratifying any such agreements in order to leave the president of Russia, so to speak, free rein for his greedy hands. Well, that's the whole story for you. In other words, there's actually no talk at all of this being some kind of memorandum about a ceasefire or ending the war. In reality, what we're dealing with is a typical agreement that, once again, just like in 2022, calls for the capitulation of Ukraine. And a question may arise: why did Putin propose exactly this kind of idea, which cannot be taken seriously right away by either the Ukrainian side, the European countries, or even the United States itself? Let us recall that the same Vice President JD then said that the Russians are putting forward absolutely unacceptable conditions, and that for some reason they want to gain control over territory they have not even captured. And US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Americans want to see whether the Russians are capable of giving up what is called in America Russia's maximalist demands. But for Putin, this doesn't matter at all, precisely because he's not looking for any real ways to end the war, but is seeking opportunities to prolong it. And for him, the negotiation process is solely a way to buy time in order to help the President of the United States block any new sanctions against the Russian Federation. He simply uses the negotiation process as a tool to block new sanctions and new pressure. And at the same time, he doesn't even try to pretend that he is ready for any constructive solutions. Moreover, he continues to hope that further military actions and increased pressure on Ukraine will force the President of the United States to agree to his maximalist demands and, together with him, pressure Ukraine into capitulation. The fact that such a turn of events would destroy Donald Trump's own reputation is something that Putin not only fails to realize. It seems he isn't particularly interested in Trump himself or his reputation, unless Trump is willing to help Putin avoid new sanctions from the civilized world and new pressure aimed at forcing him to make peace. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social media, on my Patreon channel, Buy Me a Coffee, Donatello. These all help support and develop these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Wishing you victory and peace. Good luck.